And I would like to introduce first lecturer Sebastian Ostritsch to join us on stage. I would also like to invite you to listen carefully and ask any questions that you may have at the end of lecture. I believe Sebastian will answer them best as he can.
All right, well, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. I'm really excited and glad to be here. And I'm also happy to be able to talk about something else than Hegel, which is usually my specialty, or has been for many years. And I'm fed up with talking about Hegel. So I was really happy when Peter asked me to come to speak about another thinker that I've been interested in for some time, namely Oswald Spengler. And I was asked more specifically to talk about Spengler's concept of the Faustian Man and its possible connection to transhumanism. So before I continue, can everyone understand me also in the back? Yes? Okay. If I speak too fast or too low, please let me know, and then I'll try to speak up or speak more slowly. All right, so the connection between, or possible connection between Spengler's notion of the Faustian man and transhumanism is my topic. I will proceed as follows. I will first try to sketch my understanding of transhumanism. Then I will try to shed some light on Spengler's notion of Faustian man. And finally, I will try to show that the notion of Faustian techniques is where we can find something like Spengler's, I'll say, somewhat dystopian version of transhumanism. So what is transhumanism? Well, I think we can't really understand transhumanism without first understanding humanism. And one way I like to start thinking about humanism is through the philosopher I just mentioned, namely Hegel. So you see, even though I don't want to talk about him, I always go back to him for some reason or other. So in Hegel, there is this interesting notion of man as an amphibian being. So, the amphibian being is one that exists in two types of surroundings. And the idea here is that man also belongs to two kinds of worlds. On the one hand, he is a spatio-temporal, animal-like, bodily being. And on the other hand, he's also an intellectual or spiritual being. So through thinking, he can ascend to atemporal or eternal truth, and he can also, well, not only he can, but he must. He's necessarily forced to relate to his bodily nature, to his bodily limitations, and to the fact that he has this double nature. And now the idea is that because man can, other than animals, he can relate to himself, to his own nature. By relating to himself, he somewhat, in some sense, also creates himself. He makes himself into what he will have been. This is a strange way to express it. Sounds kind of like something that Sartre would say, but I think this is at the core of this idea of man as an amphibian being. And so by shaping himself, by shaping his very existence, he can either fall back on his animal existence, he can be a kind of animal, merely an animal, or he can transcend his merely animal-like existence and become somewhat of a angel, in the sense of a spiritual being that is not limited by his bodily functions. So in this sense, man is somewhat a mix or a middle position, has a middle position between the animals and the angels, and it's up to him in which direction he moves. So what I have sketched so far is, in fact, almost precisely what one of the greatest thinkers of the Renaissance, one of the forethinkers of humanism, expressed in his famous oration on the dignity of man. I'm talking about Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. And his oration on the dignity of man from 1496 is somewhat of a manifesto of Renaissance humanism. And I will read to you now a quote by Pico della Mirandola, which I think sums up what I've been trying to express so far. So here's the quote. The highest spiritual beings were, from the very moment of creation, or soon thereafter, fixed in the mode of being, which would be theirs through measureless eternities. But upon man, at the moment of his creation, God bestowed seeds pregnant with all possibilities, the germs of every form of life. Whichever of these a man shall cultivate, the same will mature and bear fruit in him. If vegetative, he will become a plant, so not even just an animal, but a plant. If sensual, he will become brutish. If rational, he will reveal himself a heavenly being. If intellectual, he will be an angel and the son of God. Quote end. So that's Pico della Mirandola on this idea, on the core humanist idea that man's essence is not to have a fixed essence, but to be able to shape his own essence. So this is the idea of the self-creation of man, of self-transcendence. And here it is connected, well, with Pico della Mirandola, mainly to spiritual growth, with becoming angelic in a spiritual kind of sense. Now, let us compare this with transhumanism in the current sense of the word. And I know we can argue about what we mean by transhumanism, and since it's more or less of also a technical term, there could be, of course, different accounts, but I think the account I'm going to give you is at least one of the main accounts. So transhumanism is, I believe, the term of a loose movement of intellectuals, artists, scientists, and also entrepreneurs starting in the 20th century. And I think it takes up this very humanist idea of self-transcendence. That's why I think the transhumanist is, we should also stress the humanist part. So transhumanism is, in a certain sense, a humanist project. I think the first person to use this term is Julian Huxley, but I think, Ricardo, you can correct me if that's not wrong. Aldous Huxley's brother, Aldous Huxley, famously the author of Brave the World. And Julian Huxley defines the central idea of transhumanism as follows, quote, man remaining man, but transcending himself by realizing new possibilities of and for his human nature, quote end. Well, this could be just an add-on to what I read to you about by Pico della Mirandola. But now we come to the difference between humanism of old and transhumanism in this newer sense. I believe that humanists of the Renaissance type wanted man to become angelic through intellectual, cultural, ethical, and spiritual progress. Transhumanists, on the other hand, want to mainly use technology to take humanity beyond its natural boundaries. I think this becomes evident when we look at something like the Transhumanist Declaration from 1998. I will read to you a central passage from that declaration. Quote, humanity stands to be profoundly affected by science and technology in the future. We envision the possibility of broadening human potential by overcoming aging, cognitive shortcomings, involuntary suffering, and our confinement to our planet, Earth. And Max More, one of the most famous transhumanist philosophers around, wrote, quote, one point on which all transhumanists agree is the view that it is both possible and desirable to scientifically overcome biological aging and death. So here we see the idea that I think science and scientific technology has to play a key role in that kind of self-transcendence, the transcendence of like the animal bodily nature that we have. Just one side note, I think another interesting field where we clearly see transhumanist thinking today is the transgender movement. Why do I think that? Because there you have the idea of overcoming our natural biological determinations of sex through mainly medical technologies, so through some type of hormone treatments, or puberty blockers, chemical castration, or just even surgery. Okay, so much about humanism and transhumanism. Now I want to find out whether transhumanism in any kind figures in the philosophy of Oswald Spengler. Well, of course, the term did not exist yet, but my answer will be that there is some transhumanist thinking in Spengler, which is connected to his notion of the Faustian Man. But I think that Spengler has a complex attitude or evaluation of Faustian Man. He thinks that greatness and tragedy go hand in hand when it comes to the Faustian Man. So my thesis is, if you can call it a thesis, is that there are transhumanist tendencies inherent in what Spengler calls the Faustian spirit, and that these tendencies lead to humanity's own technological enslavement, or they lead to humanity's technological self-enslavement, if you like. Okay, so let me explain this thesis. In his main work, The Decline of the West, which was first published in 1918, Oswald Spengler develops a morphology of culture. In German, it's so-called Kulturmorphologie. The idea is that history is not a uniform, progressive process, but that history consists in a multiplicity of cyclical processes. And the basic unity of history is culture, or are cultures, different cultures that are endowed and characterized by a certain soul or spirit. And Spengler's understanding of culture is that a culture behaves like a living, organic entity. It runs through certain stages, just like individual organisms do, of birth, of like infancy, childhood, potent adulthood, and then aging, decline, and finally death. Our culture, the Western or Occidental culture, the German it's Abendland. I don't know, what is it in, is there a word for Abendland in Croatian? Or do you just say it's something like Occident? Because it's in German, it would be the land of the evening. So we're in the land of the evening. You don't have the Croatian translation? Is that like that? Yeah, you don't talk about it in Croatian. All right. So the Western Occidental culture, the land of the evening, is that of the Faustian spirit, the Faustian soul, or the Faustian man. So what does Spengler mean by this term, the Faustian spirit, the Faustian soul, the Faustian man? I think we can grasp Spengler's main idea if we compare the Faustian soul with other historically unique souls. And Spengler has at least three of them. He has the Magian soul, what he calls the Apollonian soul, and what he calls the Faustian soul. So let me start with the Magian soul. The Magian soul is probably the most mysterious of the three. It is, according to Spengler, the soul of the Arabian culture from roughly the year 0 to the year 1000, when its final phase began. Spengler mentions algebra, astrology, and alchemy, the mosaics and arabesques, the caliphates and the mosques, as well as, I think quite surprisingly, a whole number of religions. For instance, and that's a quote now by Spengler, the sacraments and holy books of the Persians, Jewish and Christian religions, as well as the religion of late antiquity and the Manichaean religions, quote end. So there you see Spengler categorizes historical phenomena quite differently to what we are used to today. The primordial spatial experience of the Magian soul is that of the cavern. And a cavernous character is also exhibited according to Spengler, for example, by the famous Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, or today's Istanbul. If you're ever there, check it out and try to see if you can detect this cavernous character. Now let's talk about the Apollonian soul. The Apollonian soul refers back to Nietzsche's distinction between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. It represents classical culture and is expressed through the prevalence of form, order, finitude, corporality, boundaries, tangibility, light, the artistic dominance of sculpture, the polis as a political unit, locality, and so on. The Apollonian soul blossoms and rules, according to Spengler, from roughly 1100 BC until about 200 AD, when its final phase begins. And so now on to the Faustian soul. It is, as I already said, the soul of the Western culture. And the term is obviously a reference to Goethe's two-part tragedy Faust. The first part appeared in 1808 and the second in 1832. And it's not only the play, but of course its main protagonist, Faust, Dr. Faustus. The Faustian spirit is characterized by the desire to master all fields of knowledge. Not only understand, but also to conquer and control the world. This desire in Faustian Man is so radical that it cannot ever be satisfied by anything finite. Thus, according to Spengler, the Faustian spirit of Western man shows itself in his infinite hunger to go beyond. So this beyondness is what makes Western culture truly what it is, according to Spengler. It is characterized by its striving towards infinity, by pure relationality, by an understanding of function, limitlessness, also introspection. So it's not only infinity in going outwards, but also infinity in going inside of yourself. And this endless reflection that you can see also in Western literature, self-reflection, always peeling off one psychological layer until the other, after the other, without ever getting to a last final basis or fundament. But you can always go further and deeper. This is the Faustian idea. When it comes to the arts, it is dominated by music, according to Spengler, and the political idea of dynastic rule, which also has this limitless transfer of one generation to the next. But also phenomena like placelessness, so abstraction, and so on. I hope these aspects shed some light so you get a somewhat intuitive understanding of what he means by Faustian. Once you see it, I think you go around and you see, oh yeah, that's very Faustian, but it's not a term you can just give like I think one sentence definition of. It's something best defined by examples, and at least that's the way that Spengler operates. He defines things by examples typically. According to Spengler, the Faustian soul is born around 900 AD and has entered its final phase around 1900 AD, so which would then make us living in the very final stages of the Faustian soul, of Faustian culture, Faustian civilization. Let me give you two more examples of the Faustian character, which also then which probably help to get a better understanding. Faustian mathematics and Faustian philosophy of history. What is meant by those two examples? So, Spengler's view, even mathematics are culturally relative. So his idea is that there's not just one type of mathematics, but mathematics is always relative to the kind of soul that is, cultural soul that is behind it. And for Western mathematics, he sees a radical move from the sensible to the intelligible, from the finite to the infinite, from the natural and whole to the irrational and fractional. And again, you have this tendency towards infinity. I'm just mentioning this because it shows you how deep this notion of a cultural soul or a Faustian man runs. So it's not just like some surface phenomenon, but according to Spengler, as he believes it runs all the way up or down, as you see it, even into something that we take to be as objective as mathematics. And in fact, Spengler's own project is a Faustian project. So doing philosophy of history the way that Spengler does it, and there you see this kind of self-reflection in him, is something that other cultures wouldn't have been able to do. But you need to be able to distance yourself from yourself in a way that only Faustian man can in order to do this type of philosophy of history. At least that's what Spengler believed. So even this type of so there's this moment of relativity in his of self-relativization in his thinking. Now let us consider for a moment what makes the historical self-distancing or self-alienation actually Faustian. Well, I think I already mentioned, or I already said it in a certain way. So the idea is that you're willing to relativize even your own standpoint, and not only standpoints of others. And this self-reflection is an open-ended loop, if you like. And this is the Faustian character of it. So when we talk about Faustian man today, there's one more thing that we have to take into account, namely that as for Faustian man, that there's also like a development. There are different developmental stages, just as in any culture. And so Western culture, when we talk about today's Western culture, Spengler would say we are living in a civilization. And for him, civilization is the term that signifies the last final stages of fulfillment of a culture's life. So civilization is the completion, the fulfillment, but also the coming to an end of a culture, and thus its death or decline. And the Faustian civilization is now, for Spengler, heavily characterized by technology, or he says technique, and it's usually translated in English also by techniques. So, and I will use this term techniques. And techniques plays a crucial role in this late stage of civilization. Now, what is typical of Faustian techniques? Faustian techniques wants to control, dominate, and master nature. And whereas you had, you might want to say that this is something that all technology wants to do. But Spengler would probably disagree. He would say that the classical investigator of nature contemplated nature, or tried to have some also magical means to use nature for his own purposes. But the Western man strives to direct the world in its entirety according to his will. So it's almost this megalomaniac project. So typical, like Faustian. I will talk later about. I have to look a little bit of the time, so I'll leave this out. I'll come now to what Spengler calls the machine. So another aspect of Faustian technology is the machinization of technology. Spengler just speaks of the machine. And the machine, his notion of the machine, is crucial for understanding the link between Faustian man and transhumanism. We see that the idea of a machine is somewhat that of an automated control of nature. And Spengler even speaks like this about the machine. He says that through the creation of the machine, man pretends to be God. He even has a comment where he says it's a satanic invention, which is quite unusual language for Spengler, who is not a religious philosopher. But it has, why is it satanic? Because it is the pretense of man to be like God, to control like the entirety of the cosmos according to his own will. And one invention where this is crystallized for Spengler is the invention of the steam engine. And with the steam engine, Spengler believes we get to a type of enslavement of nature, a whole transformation of economics. We also enter a stage of massive population growth. This, for him, is a product of the machine. We also have a different type of ethics that comes up through this massive technological change, which is now what used to be an ethics of work now is transformed into work ethics. So what is the main idea of ethics? Well, how you can be most productive and how you can most effectively utilize technology. And there's this amazing quote that captures really this now a certain change in valuation. For the sake of the machine, Spengler says, human life becomes precious. So human life itself is measured in worth by the degree it is able to serve technology. And in the end, we see something like a self-enslavement of man. And I already mentioned this as my main thesis, or at least that Spengler believes this. He says that Faustian man becomes the slave of his creation. Why? Because his whole outlook on the world is through technology. And all his efforts have to be kept up by keeping that technology intact, by keeping the machine running. So what starts out as an instrument of his will becomes an end in itself, because as soon as his whole existence depends on the functioning of technology in the machine, he will himself have to serve that machine. And once this point is reached, then there is also no turning back. And so I will read you one quote that really sums up this dialectical movement of self-enslavement from a later text of Spengler called Man and Technics from 1938. He says, everything organic succumbs to the encroaching organization. An artificial world permeates and poisons the natural one. Civilization itself has become a machine that does or wants to do everything like a machine. People only think in terms of horsepower. We no longer see a waterfall without converting it into electrical power in our thoughts. We don't see a country full of grazing herds without thinking about the utilization of their meat. No beautiful old craft of an indigenous population without the desire to replace it with a modern technical process. Whether it makes sense or not, technical thinking wants realization. The luxury of the machine is the result of an intellectual compulsion. The machine, like its secret ideal, the perpetual motion machine, is ultimately a symbol, a mental and spiritual, but not a vital necessity. Quote end. So I've come to the end of my time, so I'll just give you two sentences to conclude. When we think of what I told you about Pico della Mirandola, man can choose between being a plant, an animal, or an angel. And he can do this through his own cultural, ethical, and spiritual growth. He can reach that actual goal of becoming somewhat angelic. And in transhumanism, you have the idea that man can free himself from his animal nature through technology and transcend his current natural bodily limitations. But for Spengler, there is a transcendence of all boundaries inherent in the Faustian soul, which is the soul of Western culture. And this transcendence of all boundaries includes self-transcendence. And at the late stage of civilization, the Faustian man dominates Earth and himself through the machine, but ultimately becomes the slave of the machine. And Spengler's description of this process is, I believe, not really neutral. It is filled with a certain kind of sadness. But at the same time, it is a lamentation of an unavoidable destiny, according to Spengler. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ostritsch, for a very interesting presentation. We learned a lot and we gained some new perspectives about the Faustian Man and transhumanism. Now is the time for questions, if any of you have any for our lecturer.
Yeah, well, if nobody's going to ask a question, I will use this opportunity to ask something. So, first of all, thank you for this wonderful lecture. And, well, thinking about the Faustian spirit as a concept, I think it's a very interesting concept. And I think Spengler did a wonderful job at explaining some of the roots of what passes for European cultural civilization with it. What comes to my mind is, would you, and maybe Spengler in this case, say that the positivists and the Enlightenment philosopher who mostly glorified the development of technology and techniques were closer to the original Faustian European spirits than their alternative, for instance, maybe the Romantics, Nietzsche, and other anti-modernist philosophers?
Well, it's a good question, and I think if you stay true to Spengler's own understanding of how cultures work, then you would have to say, like, everything is part of the culture and is like a unique expression of it, like the blossoming and its heights, as well as its fulfillment or decline or decay. And so when he describes technology and the machine, he sometimes also has he seems to have a huge respect of this achievement. Like, this is just wonderful, like amazing, like no one else could have ever done what we have done through technology. And at the same time, it's terrible because it's our downfall. So Spengler does not want to judge things, but of course he does through his voice or his tone. But I think we shouldn't call the one more true to the Faustian spirit than the other. It's just a different phase of the Faustian spirit. I think that would be the truly Spenglerian way to answer the question.
Thank you, Professor, for wonderful lecture. I'm curious, since I remember you saying that Faustian spirit has this characteristic of being reflexive. So, does Spengler, or what are your thoughts on that? Is it possible that Faustian culture can somehow, since it's reflexive, postpone its decline? Because it sees itself, it behaves as a machine, it can learn its own operations and science of culture, let's say, and somehow postpone its death, or yeah.
That's a very nice question. I think so. If you ask me, I'm not as much of a determinist probably as Spengler, but I would agree probably with his central idea that there is something organic about cultures. And I think also that certain kinds of, that a certain type of vitality that a culture has cannot be artificially created or regained through reflection. Because otherwise, so in this point, I think I agree with Spengler then, after all, because, look at us. When you look at Western culture today, the lamentation or reflection on that something obviously is not right and what's not going right is overabundant. Everyone's seeing it now, but it's we can't do it. It's we don't have the spiritual power to come up with something else. It's we want to go back, but we can't go back. So let's do something new. So what's this something new? I don't know, because the new is not. I think is not created not created you know, on a table or on a blue. It's not like a blueprint that you come together and okay, let's make a culture. So it's just something that happens collectively and probably unconsciously. But of course, at the same time, like on an individual basis or in small aspects, I think of course we can arrange ourselves with the fact that Western culture is, in a certain sense, coming to an end, even according to Spengler. So we're not like, at least on an individual basis, we're not condemned to anything. So it's like with your own life. I mean, when you're 80 or 90 years old, you're not free to be 20 again. But it's still up to you what you do within your 90, you know? So I think, and if the analogy holds between individual organisms and collective organisms of cultures, then this would be also true for that. I hope that Spengler is wrong and that you were right, or what you suggest is right, that through reflection we could just change it. But more and more, like through empirical observation, I get convinced that probably Spengler was right in some sense.
Do we have any more questions? All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Ostritsch.